Alrighty, so foreign policy. Okay, I want to talk to you guys about foreign policy. This is specifically something that I'm really passionate about, and I've been looking into for about 2 years now. So I've read a lot of interesting stuff and a lot of different perspectives, and I've also changed my mind on this subject a lot. I originally was pretty anti-war in high school and I didn't know anything, and then after reading a few other things, I became pretty interventionist. I thought the United States should have a presence around the world, establishing liberal democracies and capitalism, and promoting those values. And also, I thought we should have some sort of moral code, moral compass, in going around the world and making sure that evil dictators couldn't hurt anybody. But since then, I've read a lot of other things, and I've come to the conclusion that I don't think we should be interventionist foreign policy-wise. Now, there's a lot of nuance to be had there, and mostly, I don't know my ideal worldview when it comes to foreign policy, but I know a few steps to go in the direction that I want, right? So, one of the things that we need to talk about is what are the motivations of terrorists? Because this is the area, foreign policy is a very broad thing, and we could talk about North Korea, we could talk about Israel, Palestine, but I'm going to focus mostly on terrorism. And even that is a huge subject. There's this sort of idea that, you're just going to, we kind of group all Islamic terrorism into one category, when it's actually far more complicated than that. We have several different types of Islamic groups, terrorist groups, each with their own different motivations and their own different brand of radical Islam. And so I'm going to just focus on the two most famous ones, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Even these two have distinct beliefs that are separate from each other, and we need to handle those accordingly. So first I want to look at Al-Qaeda, and I cite two major works by Osama bin Laden in this. He wrote in 1998, that's when he declared war on the United States. He declared a fatwa. In this fatwa, he cited 3 charges against the West and the United States for why we deserve to die and live under Islamic caliphate. So, number 1 was occupying the Middle Eastern lands. So up until that point, Bill Clinton had been occupying, more specifically, Somalia and Saudi Arabia, because that's where Osama bin Laden was at the time. And so he cites, Clinton had been living there for about, or had been occupying those lands for about 7 years, right? So, second charge was the embargo we placed on Iraq after they occupied Kuwait. So, different statistics vary the casualties, but it's largely accepted that approximately 1 million people died as a result of this embargo, or this blockade. And most of it was men, women, and children starving to death. It did make the state weaker, but those casualties were major. And different people like Glenn Greenwald, for example, have looked at different world leaders, and it depends on the politician, but a lot of them say it was worth it, a lot of them say it was not. I'm not here to make a judgment about that specific policy, but we need to understand where our enemy's motivations are. So that was the second one. The third one was our alliance with Israel. And basically, Osama bin Laden in there says that accused the U.S. of trying to make other nations weaker in the region in order to ensure Israel's survival. Again, I'm not offering a judgment on that, but that's the third indictment. And so his conclusion at the end of the fatwa is basically, quote, "The ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it." So that's the declaration of war that Osama bin Laden made against the United States. And it's interesting because when this conversation originally was occurring around Iraq, mostly, and Afghanistan, right after 9/11, 2 main arguments were made. So we have, terrorism occurs because of Islam, or terrorism occurs because of foreign policy, or our foreign policy. Unfortunately, the conclusion I've come to is the world's a complicated place. It's probably both, and it's probably a lot of other things too, right? But when it comes to Al-Qaeda, it seems that according to this, and there's another letter that Osama bin Laden wrote called Why We Hate You. And there he cites, I'm sure all of you have heard the term, terrorists hate us for our freedoms. That's from George W. Bush, said that. That's technically true, right? If we look at Osama bin Laden's letter, Why We Hate You, he says he indicts, for example, the United States for allowing gambling to be legal, right? So it's not just if I go out to gamble, certainly I deserve death for such a thing, but you deserve death for allowing me to gamble, right? So that's what he means by they hate us for our freedoms. But my conclusion, and this is just mine, I encourage all of you to read it, but it's more, I think Al-Qaeda is motivated more by a political motivation, at least from these readings, rather than their religious extremism. But that's just Al-Qaeda. So let's switch to ISIS now. So ISIS used to have a magazine. They don't anymore because all of them died, so I'm on it. But they had an article called Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You. And in it, they cite 6 reasons why the United States civilians and military deserve to die. So, and in the first 3 indictments, it's purely for religious reasons. So for example, the first line is, we hate you first and foremost because you are disbelievers. And then he goes on to number 4, we hate you because of your crimes against Islam and we wage war against you to punish you for your transgressions against our religion. Number 5 is we hate you for your crimes against the Muslims, your drones and fighter jets, bomb, kill, and maim our people. Number 6, we hate you for invading our lands and fighting. We fight you to repel you and drive you out. But then there's something at the end, and this is what I found to be the most important. They say, what's important to understand here is that although some might argue that your foreign policies are the extent of what drives our hatred, this particular reason for hating you is secondary. Hence the reason we addressed it at the end of the list above. The fact is, even if you were to stop imprisoning us, torturing us, vilifying us, and usurping our lands, we would continue to hate you, because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam. Even if you were to pay the jizya, which is the tax for non-believers, and live under the authority of Islam and humiliation, we would continue to hate you and attack you. So that, to me, reveals, and I haven't read any other ISIS material, and this could have changed, because this was in 2015, I believe. But I don't even know if Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is still alive. This reveals to me ISIS's motivations are more so religious rather than political, and it could, because they really say it. But again, it could have changed. So Al-Qaeda, it's more political. ISIS, it's more religious. The world is a complicated place again. Every other terrorist organization needs to be looked at with the same scrutiny. So now that I think I understand, and hopefully you guys have a better understanding of what the motivation of terrorism is, we need to talk about how do we solve it. And I don't know if I have the quite correct answer, but I don't think the answer is government. My main thesis here is that just like I believe with the economy, also the world civilizations, right? So the economy is just too complicated to manipulate, in my opinion. And just like every other civilization in the world, I don't think we can have just this body of organization just micromanaging every single country in the world, telling them what kind of government they can have. Especially considering that many people who come into power in our government have malicious intent or are just incompetent. So I want to go through a list, because I can't just say government is incompetent. I need to prove it. So I have a few examples throughout history about how our government has failed at managing the world since World War II. So I'm going to go over the ones I know less about, and then I'm going to go into more detail with later examples. So in 1954, the United States overthrew Guatemala's democratic government and installed a brutal dictatorship. That continues to this day, as far as I understand. In Chile, that was run, a socialist named Allende was elected, and the CIA, as far as we understand, moved in and made their recession worse. It was already going into a recession, but as far as the sources I've looked at, it made it worse, and they helped install Pinochet. And he got rid of the democratic government and installed a military dictatorship. He rounded up and killed approximately 3,000 people and put 200,000 further into concentration camps. This was the guy who famously tossed communists out of helicopters. Not a good guy in my opinion. And then we can look at, and in fact, so here's another example in Nicaragua, I believe in the 1980s under Reagan. The United Nations actually found the US guilty of war crimes by supplying helicopters. No military equipment such as guns or artillery were actually given. It was transportation, and then they would put the the guns on the transportation equipment. And he armed fascist troops against communist troops, and this was all in the effort to stop communism. Moving on to Bill Clinton, I want to focus on because I know more about his actions. And his foreign policy a lot of the times is described as not non-interventionist, but nothing really significantly sort of happened under Bill Clinton. Nobody really talks about it, at least in comparison to a lot of other presidents. For example, the New York Times described Bill Clinton's foreign policy as a noble phase of the saintly below. I want to push back against that. I think that is nonsense. And I want to highlight what I would consider war crimes committed by Bill Clinton and why exactly I don't like him as a person. So we can look at the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant as an example. In 1996, I believe, Bill Clinton was greeted with some information from his intelligence sources that found that they believed that there was a pharmaceutical plant that was just posing as a pharmaceutical plant. But in reality, it was actually a base for Al-Qaeda, who was building missiles, and they were planning on attacking American allies. So Bill Clinton hired five intelligence agencies to investigate, and they came back with the conclusion that there was no evidence to support this claim. That wasn't enough for him, however, and he decided to go ahead with a missile launch anyway. Bombed the pharmaceutical plant, and guess what? It was actually a pharmaceutical plant. It wasn't a terrorist missile site. So he sort of put his hands up, said whoopsie daisy, and moved on with his day. But what we've found is, according to the UN Commission reports that have come out in years past, is that it resulted in the deaths of approximately 2,000 to 3,000 people who couldn't gain access to medicine, even for the most preventable of disease. And as far as I know, there's been no call for Bill Clinton to be put on trial. Even though this clearly violates the Article 51 of the UN Charter that says that any country in the world cannot commit an act of force without authorization from the Security Council. Now, I have mixed feelings about that charter in general, but I find it interesting that the United States can basically do whatever it wants without any repercussion whatsoever, and in fact violate international law and also violate our Constitution, because any agreement that we enter into according to the Constitution it becomes law of the land. And since we violate the Article 51 of the UN Charter, we are in fact not only violating international law, which is a highly indictable war crime, but we are also committing, it is also unconstitutional to do so. Okay, so moving on to another example of we can look to Turkey during this time. This is one that I don't have as much information as Al-Shifa, because there's a lot more information to be known, but I can tell you what I do know. The Turkish government, at least from what I've read, was committing massive atrocities against Kurdish people, which results in the deaths of about, from the figures I saw, thousands of towns destroyed, tens of thousands murdered, hundreds of thousands of refugees. And it turns out Clinton provided approximately 80% of the arms in this crime. In fact, more arms were sent to Turkey in 1997 than during the entirety of the Cold War. In fact, several UN diplomats resigned from their posts because they declared these acts in this army to be genocidal and believed that Clinton should be charged with genocide. When the Security Council said that he had violated the Article 51, Clinton responded, quote, "The US will react multilaterally when possible, but unilaterally when necessary," unquote. So in other words, if the UN supports us in our endeavors, great, but we are going to do it anyway. Secretary of Defense William Cohen said, "Unilateral use of military power, ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources is the goal." So basically, by any means necessary in the interest of the United States. Now I'm going to move on to probably the most severe example, and the example that I find the most detestable ever committed by the United States. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Indonesian occupation of East Timor that lasted from 1975 to 1999. East Timor had gained independence from Portugal, and Indonesia was in the business of trying to occupy their lands and secure their resources. And so we had just lost Vietnam, huge humiliation. We needed clout in the region. So we decided to, President Ford and Henry Kissinger specifically decided to meet with dictator Suharto, who had already slaughtered thousands of peasants in his own country. And so we decided in secret, but you can read the documents in the National Security Archive I have, and they're pretty shocking. You can read the whole conversation that they have, and it's basically the U.S. promising to arm this invasion, knowing what Suharto, knowing that the United Nations would condemn it, and we publicly condemned it too when it started. Here's some quotes from the transcripts, and also you can look at phone calls between different members of government. Okay, so according to the U.S. State Department, the U.S. armed approximately 90% of the invasion from 1975 to 1979, President Ford initiating it, President Carter increasing the arms. In defense of this, Ford said many years later in an interview, "In the scope of things, Indonesia wasn't too much on my radar, and we needed allies after Vietnam." So it was kind of an afterthought. Assistant Secretary of State called Henry Kissinger and said, "It looks like the Indonesians have begun the attack on Timor." Kissinger responded, "I'm assuming you're going to really keep your mouth shut on the subject." In the meeting itself, Suharto said, "We want your understanding if we deem it necessary to take rapid action in East Timor." And Ford replied, "We will understand and will not press you on the issue. We understand the problem you have and the intentions you have." Kissinger agreed, although he had fears that the use of US-made arms in the invasion would be exposed to public scrutiny. Kissinger urged Suharto to wait until Ford had returned from his Far Eastern trip. And this, by the way, this is a section of the book called The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Because, quote, Kissinger says this, "We would be able to influence the reaction in America if whatever happens after we return. This way there would be less chance of people talking in an unauthorized way." The U.S. also hoped the invasion would be relatively swift and not involve protracted resistance. Kissinger said to Suharto, "It is important that whatever you do succeeds quickly." As a former senior CIA officer from the time, Philip Liechty, stated, "I saw intelligence that came back from hard-firm sources in East Timor. There were people being herded into school buildings and set on fire. There were people herded into fields and machine-gunned, all with American arms, by the way. We knew the place was a free fire zone, and that Suharto was given the green light by the United States to do what he did. We sent the Indonesian generals everything that you need to fight a major war against somebody who doesn't have any guns. We sent them rifles, ammunition, mortars, grenades, food, helicopters, you name it. They got it. None of that got out to the media. No one gave a damn. It is something that I will be forever ashamed of. The only justification I have ever heard for what we were doing was that the concern that East Timor was on the verge of being accepted as a new member of the United Nations, and there was a chance that the country was going to be able to either vote leftist or neutralist and not likely vote in the interest of the United States at the UN. Daniel Moynihan, in account of this genocide, said, he was a US ambassador to the UN, said, and he was bragging about this, by the way. This is in his memoir. The United States wished things to turn out as they did, and worked to bring it about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it out forward with inconsiderable success. So we move on now to current issues. And by the way, that genocide ended in 1999. So we stopped sending them arms in 1979, but they continued to use them. And you can look at different BBC documentaries looking at people being interviewed in the region, and most of those people being interviewed in the videos disappeared later on. And it was hard to get intelligence back because media weren't largely accepted into the region. So moving on to current day. By the way, I'm not going to use Afghanistan or Iraq or anything like that. If you haven't changed your mind due to those facts, I highly doubt there's anything I could introduce to you to change your mind. I'm just giving you facts that I think that most people don't know about, and you can judge accordingly. So I'm just about done. The International Criminal Court in New Zealand, as defined in a Washington Post article, is a unique institution. It is a court of law charged with investigating and prosecuting individuals for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And they've charged many dictators, mostly in Africa, for war crimes. And according to the I'm gonna move on to the International Criminal Court later on. But as of now, there was a study done in 2017 that found, as of now, the United States is currently supporting 73% of dictatorships, actively arming them. One example is Saudi Arabia, in which we have armed them twice. And one senator, actually, our very own Bill Nelson, voted twice to send those arms over there. And we found out, actually, that most of those arms have gone and now have transferred into Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia is dealing with Al-Qaeda sending them those arms. And Al-Qaeda's numbers have doubled since 9/11. But I haven't really seen that in the news very much. And there's also rumors that they're arming ISIS, but there's not sufficient evidence to state that, so I won't state that as fact. It's just a rumor. And then, according to Washington Post, civilian casualties have climbed 200% under Trump, and that's pretty remarkable because under Obama they were unprecedented. After 9/11, under the Bush presidency, we occupied 60 countries across the world. Under Obama, 135. Trump, 150 as of 2 weeks ago, because we invaded Tunisia, which was not recorded in the news as far as I know. I only found out because I went to a conference where a guy who knows a few people from over there told me, and I looked it up after. It turns out it's true. I can give you the articles to that if you would like. And then, okay, so I'm going to close out with a speech that John Bolton gave, I believe in November of 2017. The International Criminal Court wanted to indict the United States on war crimes, more specifically some soldiers that had committed rape and murder and unjustified actions. And this was his response at dinner.
November of 2017, the ICC prosecutor requested authorization to investigate alleged war crimes committed by U.S. service members and intelligence professionals during the war in Afghanistan. An investigation neither Afghanistan nor any other state party to the Rome Statute requested. Literally any day now, the ICC may announce the start of a formal investigation against these American patriots who voluntarily signed on to go into harm's way to protect our nation, our homes, and our families in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. The ICC prosecutor has requested to investigate these Americans for alleged detainee abuse, and perhaps more, an utterly unfounded, unjustifiable investigation. Today, on the eve of September the 11th, I want to deliver a clear and unambiguous message on behalf of the President of the United States. The United States will use any means necessary to protect our citizens and those of our allies from unjust prosecution by this illegitimate court. We will not cooperate with the ICC, we will provide no assistance to the ICC, and we certainly will not join the ICC. We will let the ICC die on its own. After all, for all intents and purposes, the ICC is already dead to us.
And that kind of reminds me of the Bill Clinton quote. How did it go? The U.S. will react multilaterally when possible, but unilaterally when necessary. Basically, UN or the ICC supports them, that's fine, but they're going to do it. We're going to do it anyway. So my first step in stopping terrorism would be to stop participating in it. That's number one. Number two, acknowledge our crimes and stop committing them. And number three, if we believe that another state is committing atrocities, the first step is not to bomb that state, but instead, as individuals, we need to empower those rebels, because as one of Obama's former foreign policy advisors said, the United States, from her experience, is very good at destroying things, but not in creating things. We cannot go around installing democracies and thinking that we can just convince people of capitalism. They need to be left alone. We need to recognize the incompetency of government, both in economics and in foreign policy. So that's my comment.